The Holloway cellar had always been colder than the rest of the house, a place where light seemed hesitant to enter and warmth fled as soon as it arrived. When Elias Holloway turned 10, his father carried his mattress down the creaking staircase without a word, setting it against the stone wall the same way he had for the older brothers before him. No one ever explained why the sons slept down here. It was simply the rule, unchallenged, unbroken, unquestioned. But Elias felt an unease that none of the others ever spoke about, as if the cellar itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to be left alone in the dark. On his third night, he awoke to the sound of a soft tapping beneath the floorboards. Slow, rhythmic, almost deliberate. He held his breath, certain it was a dream, until the tapping stopped, only to be followed by what sounded like a long, dragging breath rising from somewhere beneath him. Elias froze, staring at the wooden planks beneath his blanket, half expecting them to shift. They didn't, but something else did. A faint, cold draft swept across his ankles, even though there were no windows, no vents, no openings anywhere in the cellar. The next morning, he mentioned it to his mother, who was stirring something thick and dark on the stove. She didn't look at him. Didn't speak. Her hand trembled once before she steadied it. Then she whispered only one sentence, barely audible over the bubbling pot: "Do not look for where the sounds come from." It wasn't a warning. It was a plea. That night, Elias lay awake listening to the silence, hoping the noises wouldn't return. But they did. The tapping was slower this time, heavier, and each strike seemed to pulse through the floor like a heartbeat. He edged his fingers toward the plank closest to his mattress. It was warm from the other side. That was when he heard the whisper. A soft, broken voice, breathing his name from somewhere below the floorboards, as if it had been waiting for him to finally listen. Elias pulled his hand away and curled beneath his blanket, but curiosity gnawed at him with every sound, every breath, every whisper rising from beneath his feet. And on the following night, during a storm that killed the power and plunged the house into absolute darkness, something new happened. The plank beneath his bed lifted. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough for Elias to see the outline of a rusted metal handle hidden beneath the wood. He stared at it, paralyzed, the storm rumbling above him while something shifted in the hollow space below, pushing upward again, as if encouraging him to open the door no Holloway son was ever meant to find. The Holloway family's strange tradition began long before Elias was born, whispered about only in fragments and half-remembered stories that never offered any real explanation. Every son, without exception, was moved into the cellar the moment he turned 10. It didn't matter if the child was timid, fragile, or terrified of the dark, the rule was as unshakable as the old stones that held the house together. To outsiders, it seemed bizarre, but no one outside the Holloway family ever stayed long enough to ask real questions. The few who did were met with tight smiles and quick subject changes. Inside the home, the rule was treated as a rite of passage, though no one dared call it that openly. The older brothers never spoke of their time in the cellar, brushing off any mention of it with a shrug or an uneasy laugh. Their silence wasn't the kind that came from forgetfulness, it was the kind that came from memory too unsettling to revisit, the kind that weighed heavily in their eyes even when their mouths insisted it was nothing. When Elias's 10th birthday approached, he sensed the shift in the household. His father became quieter, watching him with a look that was neither warm nor cold, only resigned. His mother became more attentive in strange ways, lingering at his door at night as if memorizing the sound of his breathing. His brothers avoided him entirely in the final days before the move, as though being too close might remind them of what they had tried so hard to bury. The cellar itself carried a presence that Elias could feel even before he stepped into it. The air seemed heavier there, thick with the dampness of earth and something older, as if the walls had a memory of their own. He had passed the cellar door his entire life, always feeling a chill radiate from behind it, but now the chill felt personal, like recognition. On the night he was finally sent down, there was no ceremony, no comforting words, just the low thud of his father placing the mattress on the cold floor. Elias tried to ask why every son, why only at 10, why the cellar, but the words died the moment his father's eyes met his. There was no cruelty in them, only a deep, hollow fear, the kind a man carries when he has lived with something too long to ever escape. That fear told Elias more than any answer could have, and it lingered long after the footsteps retreated and he was left alone in the dark. Elias had always been a light sleeper, the kind who woke at the slightest creak of the house settling or the soft rustle of wind against the windows. But the cellar had a different kind of quiet, one that felt too deep, too thick, as if the darkness pooled in corners where sound didn't dare travel. On his first nights down there, he lay awake listening to the stillness, trying to grow used to the new space. Yet every time he closed his eyes, he felt as though something beneath him remained awake, listening back. The first whisper of sound came on a night when the house above was especially silent. It started as a faint tapping, so soft that Elias almost dismissed it as his imagination. But the rhythm was too deliberate, too patient to be random. He sat up slowly, his breath held tight in his chest, staring at the floorboards lit only by the thin slice of moonlight leaking through the high, narrow basement window. The tapping continued, spaced apart like someone counting time. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped, replaced by a low, muffled breath drawn from somewhere deep below the planks. Elias's heart hammered in his ears as he leaned closer, unsure whether he wanted confirmation or comfort. The breath came again, longer this time, heavier, as if whoever or whatever was beneath him had been waiting a very long time to be heard. He scrambled back to his mattress, pulling his blanket around him even though it offered no warmth in the icy room. He told himself it had to be the house settling or pipes cooling or the wind finding a crack somewhere in the old foundation. But the cellar had no pipes, and the air down there never moved on its own. Over the next nights, the sounds grew more distinct. Sometimes it was tapping, sometimes a soft dragging scrape, and sometimes it was breathing wet, slow, and unmistakably human. Elias tried burying his head under the blanket, but the noises seeped through the silence like whispers meant only for him. What unsettled him most wasn't just the sound but the way the floor beneath his mattress seemed to pulse faintly with each breath, as if the wooden boards were being touched or pressed from the other side. He began noticing that the noises came at nearly the same hour every night, always when the rest of the house had slipped into deep sleep. It felt intentional, almost expectant, as though something beneath the floor had learned the rhythm of the household and waited for the right moment. Elias started counting the seconds between each tap, each breath, trying to make sense of a pattern that seemed to shift just enough to keep him guessing. No one else heard it. No one else felt it. And as the nights stretched on, Elias realized he wasn't simply hearing sounds, he was being called. Elias tried convincing himself that the noises were nothing more than tricks of an old house, but the cellar had a way of dismantling every excuse he clung to. By the seventh night, he was no longer startled by the tapping or the drawn-out breaths slipping through the cracks. What unnerved him now was the subtle movement he began to feel beneath him, small shifts, almost imperceptible at first, as though the floorboards were reacting to the presence of whatever lingered below. The plank nearest his mattress, a narrow strip of darkened wood warped with age, started to lift at one end during the noises. It rose only a fraction of an inch, barely noticeable unless he was looking directly at it, but it rose all the same. Elias watched it one night with the pale glow of the moon illuminating the edges, and he saw it rise and fall in a rhythm that matched the tapping from beneath. He pressed his fingers against it afterward, trying to determine whether it was loose, but the plank lay flat and stubborn, as if it had never moved at all. Over the next few nights, Elias became obsessed with that single board. He would lie awake, staring at it, waiting for the precise moment when the tapping would begin. And without fail, whenever the noise returned, the plank answered with a slow, deliberate tilt. It didn't matter if he placed his mattress farther away or tried to sleep on the opposite side of the cellar, the board moved whenever the sounds came. It was as though the thing beneath wasn't reacting randomly but responding directly to him, aware of his listening, aware of his fear. Once, unable to control his curiosity, Elias leaned over the board and pressed his ear against the cold wood. He could feel a faint warmth radiating from below, as if someone or something was living in a space concealed beneath the floor. The warmth pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, steady and wrong in a way that made his skin crawl. He jerked back instantly, his heart pounding too fast to steady itself. But even from a distance, he could see the plank lift again, this time with a little more force, as though whatever was beneath had felt his presence and was responding to it. The shifting became more frequent after that. Some nights the plank tilted several times, almost like a signal or a summons. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that it wanted him to touch it again, to pull it up, to see what lay in the darkness below. The cellar felt more alive with every passing night, more aware of him, watching him with a patience that felt ancient. And as much as Elias wanted to pretend he was imagining it all, the truth pressed up from beneath the floorboards, impossible to ignore, urging him closer with every subtle shift of the wood. Elias had never paid much attention to the framed photographs that lined the hallway of the Holloway house. They were old, sun-faded, and arranged in uneven rows that traced the family line through generations, each picture showing boys who all seemed to share the same hollow-eyed expression. One afternoon, while the rest of the family slept or pretended to, he wandered the corridor to distract himself from the thought of another night in the cellar. His gaze drifted slowly across the frames until something caught his attention, an older photograph he had somehow never noticed before. It hung slightly crooked, tucked between two larger portraits, as if someone wanted it hidden but couldn't quite bring themselves to remove it completely. The photograph showed his father much younger, standing beside a woman who looked eerily like Elias's mother but wasn't her. At their feet were 5 boys lined up in age order. Elias recognized 3 of them as his older brothers, though their faces were rounder, untouched by the fear that would settle into them years later. The 4th face belonged to Elias himself, but younger, maybe 5 or 6. It was the 5th boy who made him freeze. He didn't recognize him at all. The boy stood at the end of the line, slightly apart from the others, his expression a strange mixture of defiance and sadness. He appeared to be about 12 older than Elias was now, but not old enough to have been someone the family would simply forget. Elias counted again, his pulse quickening. There were only 4 Holloway sons. His parents had said it for years, repeated it without hesitation. Yet here was proof of another, a boy whose existence had been erased so thoroughly that even the brothers refused to speak of him. He reached up and touched the glass, tracing the outline of the unfamiliar boy's face. The more he looked, the more he noticed the unsettling details. Unlike the others, the boy's eyes were not turned toward the camera but slightly downward, as though something on the ground had caught his attention or as though he refused to look directly at the person taking the picture. His posture was tense, shoulders pulled inward, and though everyone else in the photograph wore forced Holloway smiles, his expression remained stubbornly empty. Elias felt a chill slide down his spine as he stepped back. In that moment, the cellar noises, the shifting plank, the strange warmth beneath the floor, everything began to tangle together. He wondered why no one had mentioned this missing brother, what had happened to him, and why the photograph seemed deliberately hidden from view. Most of all, he wondered why the boy's name had never been spoken and why, as he stared at the picture, he felt an unmistakable sense of recognition, as though the boy in the photograph had been waiting all along for someone to notice he was missing. Elias couldn't shake the image of the forgotten boy from the photograph. All throughout the day the memory of that unfamiliar face clung to him, following him through every room of the house no matter how hard he tried to distract himself. He had questions, far too many, and yet every time he tried to form them into words, something tightened in his throat. It wasn't fear of being scolded, it was fear of the answer itself. Still, as the afternoon light dimmed and the quiet before night settled into the Holloway home, Elias found himself drifting into the kitchen where his mother worked over a simmering pot. She didn't look up when he entered, though Elias knew she sensed him in the doorway. She always did. Her hands moved a little faster, her shoulders stiffened, and her breathing grew shallow, as if bracing against something she hoped wouldn't arrive. He sat at the table, staring at the worn patterns in the wood, summoning the courage to ask the one question he knew he wasn't supposed to ask. When he finally spoke, his voice came out softer than he intended, barely louder than the gentle bubbling from the stove. He asked her who the extra boy in the photograph was. The ladle in her hand slipped slightly, striking the edge of the pot with a dull clang. She didn't turn around. She didn't even pretend not to hear him. Instead, her entire body went still in a way that seemed too controlled to be natural, like someone trying to hold themselves together against an unseen force. For a long moment she said nothing. Elias could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the distant creaking of the house settling, and the faint hum of wind against the windows. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't gentle or soothing the way it normally was. It was low, brittle, and laced with something close to dread. She told him to stay away from the past, to forget whatever he saw and whatever he thought he understood. She said some things in the family were buried for a reason, and digging at them would only bring back what should remain gone. Elias tried to press her, insisting that he deserved to know who the boy was, but his mother cut him off sharply, something he had rarely seen her do. She turned just enough for him to see her face, and the fear in her eyes was unmistakable, an old, exhausted kind of fear that suggested she had carried this weight far longer than he had been alive. She told him never to speak of the boy again, never to ask questions about the photograph, and most importantly, never to listen too closely to the cellar. Then, in a whisper that trembled as if pulled from the deepest part of her, she warned him that some sounds in the dark didn't want to be understood, they wanted to be answered. The storm arrived without warning, rolling over the Holloway house with a weight that made the windows tremble in their frames. Elias had always disliked storms, but this one felt different. The air carried a strange heaviness, as though the world above ground was bracing for something that had nothing to do with thunder or rain. By nightfall, the sky had blackened into a thick sheet, cutting off the moonlight that usually crept into the cellar. The house flickered with brief pulses of light as the electricity struggled against the wind. Elias watched from the bottom of the stairs, hoping the power would hold, because even the dim glow of the cellar bulb felt safer than complete darkness. It didn't hold. With a sharp snap, the lights went out, plunging the entire house into a suffocating darkness. Elias stood frozen for a moment, listening to the muffled groans of the storm outside. Then, slowly, the noises he had grown accustomed to, the tapping, the dragging breaths, returned, but deeper now, more resonant, as if the darkness fed them strength. Without the thin distraction of light, every sound became sharper, clearer, impossible to ignore. The cellar felt smaller, pressing in around him, and the silence between each echo stretched too long, like something waiting. He crawled toward his mattress, trying to feel his way across the cold floor, but before he could settle, he heard it, a whisper. Not the faint sighing he'd heard on previous nights, but a voice, soft and broken, rising from beneath the floorboards as though carried through the wood itself. It spoke his name. Elias froze, every muscle locked in place as the sound drifted upward, coated in a kind of longing that made his skin crawl. It wasn't a scream, not a threat, it was an invitation, gentle and patient, as though whoever whispered had been waiting years for the chance to speak again. Then came the tapping, not rhythmic this time but urgent, frantic, like fingers pressing repeatedly against the underside of the planks. The familiar board near his mattress shifted, lifting slightly even in the pitch-black darkness. Elias stared at the faint outline of its edge, barely visible, but unmistakably moving. Each tap vibrated through the floor, echoing all the way into his ribs. Lightning flashed through the tiny window, illuminating the cellar for a split second, and in that brief moment Elias thought he saw dust rising through the cracks in the wood, as if something below had disturbed the earth. The thunder swallowed the moment, and darkness returned with full force. The whisper came again, closer this time, almost pleading. Elias pressed his hand over his ears, trying to block it out, but the voice hummed through the floor itself, through his mattress, through the air that wrapped tightly around him. For the first time, he realized the storm wasn't what woke whatever lived beneath him. It was the blackout. The silence. The darkness deep enough to let something else breathe. Elias lay rigid in the darkness long after the whisper faded, trying to convince himself that the blackout had made everything feel worse than it really was. But the storm didn't let up, and every crash of thunder seemed to throb through the cellar walls, shaking loose small clouds of dust that drifted onto his blanket. He pulled the thin fabric tighter around himself, though it offered no comfort. It wasn't the cold that unsettled him this time, it was the feeling that the thing beneath the floor was no longer simply making noise. It was moving with intention. The tapping returned, slower now, but stronger, as though each strike was testing the strength of the wood. Then came the unmistakable sound of a long, dragging pull, something hard scraping directly beneath the plank that had been shifting for nights. Elias sat up despite the terror gripping his stomach, his breath shallow as he stared into the black shape of the floor in front of him. Another faint glow of lightning filtered through the tiny window, enough to outline the floorboards for the briefest moment. In that flash, Elias saw the warped plank tilt upward, not the slight shiver of past nights, but a meaningful lift enough that he could see a sliver of darkness beneath it, like a mouth opening to breathe. He scrambled back, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. The plank settled for a moment, pressed back into place as if whatever had moved it was gathering strength. The sounds beneath him grew quieter, replaced by something eerier, a soft, rhythmic thrum. Not quite a heartbeat, not quite a hum, but something alive. The next time lightning lit the room, Elias noticed the plank rise again, higher this time, angled just enough for him to see the edge of something metal glinting beneath it. A handle. Rusted, old, and embedded in the earth beneath the boards. His pulse quickened as he realized the floor wasn't shifting because the wood was loose. It was shifting because something below was pushing it open, revealing what had been hidden, buried, or forgotten long before he ever slept there. The storm raged on, and the darkness seemed to thicken around him. He crawled closer despite himself, drawn by a mixture of fear and a strange pull he didn't understand. When he reached the plank, he hesitated, placing his hand on the cold wood. It vibrated softly under his palm, reacting to his touch like a living thing. The handle beneath shifted again, scraping against the earth as though turning on its own. The plank lifted just enough that Elias saw the truth fully: the cellar floor was not solid. It was a door someone had once built to be hidden. A door that something on the other side had been trying, night after night, to open. Elias's hand lingered on the edge of the plank, trembling despite his attempts to steady it. The metal handle beneath the wood was cold to the touch, slick with a dampness that smelled faintly of rust and earth. He hesitated, his mind torn between terror and a curiosity so sharp it ached in his chest. Every instinct screamed for him to pull back, to leave the hidden door as it was and pretend he hadn't seen it, but another part of him, the part that had lain awake every night listening to whispers, taps, and breaths from beneath the cellar floor, urged him forward. Slowly, carefully, he lifted the plank, and the floor beneath him shifted open with a low groan, as though the house itself were protesting the intrusion. A cold draft escaped from the newly revealed opening, carrying with it the scent of soil, damp decay, and something older, fouler, something that made his stomach tighten and his skin crawl. The air seemed to whisper against his face, carrying with it a hint of secrets long buried and long feared. The opening revealed a narrow void, a shaft of darkness that seemed impossibly deep for the cellar it had been hidden beneath. Elias could see the rough edges of the floorboards framing the doorway, the faint glimmer of the rusted metal hinges, and the dirt-streaked walls of a space he had never imagined existed. His imagination raced, conjuring possibilities both terrifying and unthinkable, but the smell, heavy, earthy, with undertones of rot, kept him grounded in the reality that this was not a trick, not a dream. It was real. Something had been down there, breathing, shifting, and waiting for him to find it. He knelt beside the opening, peering into the darkness as the storm raged above. Rain hammered the roof, thunder shook the walls, but down here, in this secret cavity, the air was unnervingly still except for the faint, irregular sound that seemed to come from deeper within. A scraping noise, like claws or fingernails against the walls of a tunnel, echoed faintly, accompanied by a soft, uneven draft that made the edges of his hair lift. The more he stared, the more he felt the cellar itself fading away, as if the hidden chamber had always existed in parallel, coiling beneath the familiar space of the floorboards he had slept on for nights. Elias's pulse pounded in his ears as he traced the contours of the doorway with his fingertips. Every instinct in his body screamed to stop, to retreat to the relative safety of the cellar above, but something, a force he could neither name nor resist, pushed him forward, closer to the threshold. The opening was not just a gap in the floor, it was a gateway into the unknown, a space that had been sealed and concealed for reasons that his family would never speak of, a place that promised revelations the likes of which he could scarcely imagine, and yet the moment he looked down into it, he knew that whatever lay beyond the metal hinge and the soil-scented air had been waiting for him to open it. Elias leaned closer to the opening, his chest tight, his fingers brushing against the edge of the rusted handle as though it might anchor him to reality. Below the cellar floor stretched a narrow passage, carved roughly into the earth, its walls jagged and scarred with deep, erratic scratches. The marks ran in uneven patterns, some jagged and desperate, others precise and deliberate, as if a restless hand had clawed at the stone for years. His eyes followed the lines, tracing their path deeper into the darkness, and he began to notice something far more disturbing: names etched into the walls. At first, they seemed faded, almost worn away by time, but as his eyes adjusted, the letters became legible. Each name was accompanied by a date, stretching back decades, a chronicle of those who had entered or perhaps been forced into the hidden depths beneath the Holloway cellar. His heart pounded as he traced the names with his fingertips, unable to stop himself. One of the names made him gasp, a chill slamming into him with the force of sudden revelation. It was his missing brother, the boy from the photograph, listed alongside a date that made the blood run cold. The realization that the family's silence had a reason hit him fully now. This passage had been a prison, a place the Holloways had hidden, a space where the living and the lost were tangled together. The scratch marks weren't random, they were the desperate attempts of those trapped within to escape, to leave their mark, to tell anyone, that they had existed. Elias's mind raced as he knelt there, staring into the tunnel. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp soil and decay, carrying the faint metallic tang of old blood. Every sound he had heard from the cellar, the tapping, the dragging breaths, the whispers, now made sense as echoes from deep within this hidden place. And yet, the tunnel was not empty. There was movement, subtle and almost imperceptible at first, a shadow shifting just beyond the reach of his eyes, as if someone or something was waiting for him to follow. The scratch marks seemed to beckon him, leading him deeper into the darkness, the way a trail of warning might guide or deceive a traveler. He could feel the history pressing against him, the weight of generations who had slept in the cellar, some resigned to their fate, others frantically trying to escape. Every name etched into the walls whispered stories of fear, captivity, and secrets meant to be buried. And as Elias peered further, he realized the passage didn't simply end, it continued downward, winding, narrowing, coiling into the earth like a vein of shadow. The tunnel was alive with memory and menace, and something deep inside him understood that crossing its threshold would mean stepping into a story that had been waiting for him, for someone, for a son willing or perhaps foolish enough to answer the pull from beneath the Holloway floorboards. Elias's hands trembled as he pressed forward into the narrow passage, each step careful, deliberate, the cold dirt scraping against his knees. The air grew thicker with every inch he descended, the scent of damp earth mingled now with something fouler, something metallic, sharp and unyielding. The faint scratch marks on the walls seemed to grow more frantic, jagged lines carved by unseen hands, urging him onward while warning him at the same time. His heartbeat echoed in his ears, loud enough to drown out the faint rustling sounds that seemed to follow him, just beyond his field of vision. Shadows twisted in corners of the tunnel, and with every passing second, Elias felt the space constrict, as though the walls themselves were closing in, guiding him, corralling him toward something he was only beginning to understand. At first, he thought he saw nothing but the dark, narrow corridor stretching endlessly beneath the house. Then, just as his muscles began to ache from the crawl, a faint light appeared ahead, a flickering, wavering glow that seemed impossible, like candlelight struggling to exist in a place where no flame should burn. He moved toward it, each movement deliberate, careful not to make a sound that might summon whatever was waiting in the dark. The glow grew brighter as he approached, revealing a small, chamber-like space just beyond the tunnel's bend. The walls here were covered with names, dates, and symbols, carved deep into the stone as though whoever had been here long ago wanted to leave a record, a warning, and a legacy all at once. The air was heavier now, almost suffocating, and Elias realized that the sound of breathing, faint but unmistakably alive, was coming from this very room. He stepped fully into the chamber, and the light flickered across the space, illuminating a figure crouched in the corner. At first, he thought it was a boy, perhaps another Holloway lost to the same tradition that had trapped generations before him. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw the shape more clearly, twisted, almost human, yet not quite. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and it turned its head toward him, revealing a face pale, hollow-eyed, and entirely familiar. The thing had been waiting, and for a moment, time itself seemed to freeze. The scratching on the walls, the whispers, the shifting plank, and the metallic tang in the air all converged into a single, suffocating realization. The cellar's secrets were not simply buried beneath the floor, they were alive. Elias took a step back, feeling the weight of every generation of Holloway sons pressing down on him, the legacy of fear and secrecy made flesh in the creature before him. And as it moved slightly, as if acknowledging his presence, he knew in his bones that the story of the Holloway cellar was not just history, it was ongoing, and that whatever he had discovered in the hidden depths would change everything about the family he thought he knew, forever binding him to the dark truth that had waited patiently beneath the floorboards for generations.